60 engines sound like weather when they come down Route 9 together, a low front moving in under a white October sky, and if you were standing at the pumps of the Black Ridge truck stop that morning, you would have felt it in your sternum before you heard it in your ears. They were not coming to save her. By the time the first headlight broke the tree line, she was already 3 days into a silence no engine could reach, tubes and monitors keeping vigil in a hospital room 40 miles east, a room that smelled like antiseptic and cut flowers nobody had thought to throw away. They were coming to finish something. You should know that before anything else, before the boots, before the ledger, before the boy with no last name, and the girl who slept in a laundromat for 6 weeks, because the ending changes how you carry the beginning. Stay with this one. Tell us in the comments what town you're watching from. Subscribe if brotherhood still means something to you. There is a woman in this story who never asked to be remembered, and by the end you will understand why 60 grown men rode 2 hours in the cold to make sure she was. But 11 years is a long runway, and this story doesn't start with engines. It starts smaller than that. It starts with a bell, the small brass one bolted above a door that hadn't been painted since 1988, and a woman with flower-white hair and a leather apron gone shiny at the hips from 3 decades of the same motions, sitting at a workbench that had outlived her husband, her son, and most of her illusions about how life was supposed to go. The truck stop sat where Route 9 forgot to keep being a highway and became, for about 400 yards, something closer to a town. 2 pumps, a diner sign missing its O, and a shoe repair shop no bigger than a horse stall, wedged between the restrooms and a vending machine that ate quarters and gave nothing back. Truckers knew her the way they know weather. Reliable, unremarkable, always there. They brought her boots with blown soles and picked them up a day later. Resewn, resold, $12 even, cash only. What they didn't know, what almost no one knew, was what happened after the diner lights went dark and the last rig cut its engine for the night. That was when the other customers came. Thin ones, silent ones, kids who didn't make eye contact and didn't have $12, and didn't, most of them, have a home to walk back to when the boots were done. She never asked where they'd come from. She never charged them a cent. And in a drawer beneath her awl and her waxed thread, wrapped in a rag that had once been a dish towel, she kept a book that recorded every one of them, a book nobody had opened but her, in 11 years, until the afternoon her heart forgot how to keep a rhythm and her body found the concrete floor before anyone found her at all. The bell above the shop door did not ring when he pushed through it, because the bell had come loose from its screw 2 winters back, and she had never gotten around to fixing what wasn't hers to fix for money. He noticed the silence of it first. A shop like that should have had noise, the scrape of a rasp, the tap of a hammer finding a nail, the low radio hum she kept tuned to a gospel station out of Wheeling. Instead, there was the compressor from the vending machine, cycling on, cycling off, and under it, nothing. He was 54 years old and had learned, across 3 decades of hauling freight through every kind of American dark, that silence in a place meant for noise was a language of its own. He had heard it in truck cabs where the driver had pulled over to die quiet rather than call for help. He had heard it in his own house, the year his wife left and took the noise with her. He did not walk toward it carelessly. He walked toward it the way a man walks toward wreckage he already suspects. She was on the floor between the workbench and a shelf of unclaimed boots, one arm flung out as if she had been reaching for the phone mounted on the wall and had not made it the last 18 inches. Her lips had gone the color of a bruise 3 days old. Her chest moved, but barely, the way a leaf moves in air that isn't quite wind. He knelt. He did not touch her the way people touch the injured in movies, urgent and clumsy. He touched her the way you check something you're afraid of breaking further. 2 fingers at the throat, an ear near the mouth, counting. He had the phone out and the numbers dialed before he let himself look at anything else. It was while he waited, crouched on the concrete with one hand resting flat against her back so she would know, even unconscious, that someone was there, that his eyes crossed the workbench and found the book lying open beside her awl. He did not read it, not then. He only saw the pages, dense, small handwriting, dates in the left margin going back further than he could guess from a glance, and beside some names a small check mark, like a thing crossed off a list that mattered. The dispatcher's voice kept talking in his ear, asking questions he answered without thinking. Location, condition, breathing, while some older, quieter part of him understood that whatever this book was, it should not be left on a floor for a mop bucket or a landlord's broom to find. He slid it into the inside pocket of his cut before the ambulance lights ever touched the gravel outside. The paramedics moved her with the practiced gentleness of people who had done this 1,000 times and still meant it. A hand cradling the back of her head, a voice low and steady near her ear, though she gave no sign of hearing it. He stood back against the doorframe of the shop, out of the way, watching the small room he had never once entered in 3 years of buying diesel across the lot. It smelled of leather oil and old wood smoke, and something else underneath, something like thread wax, and the shelves were lined floor to ceiling with boots, some resoled, some half-finished, laces coiled beside them in neat, patient loops. None of them had price tags. He noticed that before he understood why it mattered. The gurney wheels caught once on the doorframe's metal lip, and a paramedic swore softly, apologized to no one, and pushed through. He followed them out into the lot where the light had gone the flat white of early afternoon, heat lifting off the asphalt in visible sheets, and watched the ambulance doors close on her without ceremony, the way doors close on freight. No family stood there. No one asked to ride along. He gave his name to a deputy who had arrived without being told why, gave a version of events with the shape but not the weight of what happened, and did not mention the book. He drove to the clubhouse instead of home. It was 11 miles down Route 9, past the feed store and the shuttered movie theater, with its marquee frozen forever on a film title from another decade, past the turnoff, to the river, where teenagers still parked at night out of habit rather than hope. The bike ran rough under him, vibration climbing up through his boots into his knees, the way it always did on long stretches, and the whole time the weight of the ledger sat against his ribs like something breathing. The clubhouse lot was half empty at that hour. A handful of bikes leaned on kickstands, one older member sanding rust off a fender in the shade. He didn't speak to any of them. He went inside, past the bar nobody manned before 6, into the back room, where the light came gray through one high window, and sat at the long table alone, with the book finally open in front of him. The first page had a date, 11 years old, and a name that wasn't really a name. Just a word, a nickname, the kind kids gave each other on the road, when their real ones felt too dangerous to say out loud. Beside it, a single line. Boy, maybe 15, boots gone through at the heel, gave him wool socks too. No checkmark. He turned the page. The second entry carried a checkmark, small and precise, made with the same pencil stub that had written the name. He ran his thumb over it without meaning to, the way a man tests a scar to see if it still hurts. Third page, fourth. The handwriting never changed. Patient, unhurried, the letters of a woman who had spent a lifetime pulling thread through leather and knew the value of a line drawn straight. Some entries ran 2 sentences. Most ran 1. Girl, no shoes at all. Gave her the brown boots from the donation box. Too big but warm. Checkmark. Boy, back again. Same boots. Resold twice now. Checkmark. He found himself counting pages instead of reading them, the way a man counts mile markers on a night drive to keep from thinking about how far he still has to go. Outside, the sander stopped. A door somewhere in the clubhouse opened and shut. He didn't look up. By the 20th page, his hands had gone still on the table, flat on either side of the book like he was steadying it against wind that wasn't there. He recognized a description before he recognized why. A boy with a scar through one eyebrow, always barefoot even in October, who used to sleep behind the ice machine at the truck stop before anyone official ever noticed him. He remembered that boy. He remembered giving him a ride once, 40 miles, dropping him at a gas station, and never thinking of him again. In the ledger, the entry read, October, boy with the eyebrow scar, put new laces on both boots, told him to eat something. Checkmark, dated 3 months later. Someone else had seen to it. Someone always had. He turned more pages faster now, less reading than searching, though he couldn't have said what for. The dates moved forward year by year, the seasons changing in single lines. Snow on his boots, dried them by the register before I fixed the sole, and always the same hand, never tired, never careless, never once writing more than the moment required. 11 years pressed flat between two covers, and not one page asked to be thanked for it. The older member appeared in the doorway, wiping rust dust from his palms onto his jeans, and said nothing when he saw the look on the mechanic's face. He'd been in this life long enough to know when a man needed the room kept quiet. Near the back of the book, the pencil grew fainter, the hand slower, as if the writing itself had aged along with the woman holding it. He reached the last completed page and stopped there, breath caught somewhere between his ribs and his throat, because the 3 pages after it held names with nothing beside them at all. No check marks, no closing line, just names, waiting. He read the first of the 3 names twice, as if the second reading might add a mark that the first had missed. Bird. No date beside it that meant anything, just a season. Late fall. And beneath it, 4 words in a hand gone thin as wire. Left before the soul set. Nothing else. No return visit noted, no line drawn through to close the account the way every other page in the book had been closed. Gently, like a door pulled to instead of slammed. The second name was shorter still. Nell. A month, a year, and beneath it? Cried when I measured her foot, didn't ask why. That was all. No mark, no word of where she'd gone, or whether she'd gone anywhere at all. The third had no name to speak of, only a description worn into a kind of name through repetition. The kid from the blue truck. 3 separate entries, months apart, the same boy circling back through the lot like a moth that hadn't yet found the flame that would finish it. The last of the 3 lines read, "Asked if I had steel toes. I didn't. Told him to come back Tuesday." There was no 4th entry, no Tuesday recorded. The mechanic sat with that for longer than he meant to. Outside, a diesel horn sounded twice on the interstate, faint and far off. The kind of sound that used to mean something to him once. A man calling to no one in particular, the way lonely men do at the wheel of something too big for one person to drive alone. He did not look up until the older member cleared his throat from the doorway. "She keep all of 'em like that?" the older man asked, though he already knew, and the mechanic understood the question wasn't really about the ledger. "All but 3, he said. The older man came and stood behind his shoulder and looked down at the page without touching it, the way a man looks at a grave marker he isn't ready to kneel beside yet. He read the 3 names in silence. When he spoke again, his voice had gone rough, in a way the mechanic hadn't heard from him before, not even the night they'd buried one of their own out past the county line. "Bird," he said, like he was tasting the word for a memory. "There was a kid used to hang around the Sinclair station before it closed. Skinny. Wouldn't take a ride unless you swore on something first." The mechanic didn't answer. He was already closing the book gently, the way she would have, the way the whole book seemed to demand of anyone who held it, and setting it flat on the workbench where it had been found. Outside, the light had gone the color of rust, the sun dropping low and orange behind the pumps, and somewhere past the tree line, a truck downshifted hard, the sound of it rolling through the lot like something remembered rather than heard. "We're not leaving those blank," the mechanic said. No one answered him. No one needed to. The room had gone quiet in the particular way a room goes quiet when a decision has already been made before anyone says it out loud. Chairs scraped. A man near the door pulled his phone from his cut and started scrolling through contacts he hadn't touched in years. Names of riders who'd moved on, gone straight, gone under. Another reached for the coffee pot that had gone cold 2 hours ago and drank it anyway, because his hands needed something to do that wasn't shaking. The mechanic looked at the clock above the bar, 11:40. He thought about the hospital 30 miles east, the fluorescent hallway he'd stood in that afternoon, while a nurse asked him questions he didn't have answers to. Did she have family? Did she have a next of kin? Did he know her blood type? And how the only true thing he could tell them was a name written 91 times in a book he wasn't supposed to have. "Call the Ridgeback chapter," someone said. "They run that stretch past the county line more than we do." Call Route Nine's people too. If this kid Bird was working the Sinclair, somebody up that way saw him after it closed. The names started moving through the room like sparks jumping a gap. Not shouted, not urgent in the way men get urgent about money or turf, but low and steady, the way men talk when they've already agreed on something and are only now working out how. A rider with a service dog tag still clipped to his vest said he remembered a girl matching the description of Nell, maybe 2 winters back, sleeping in the covered bay behind the tire shop before the owner ran her off. Another man, quieter than the rest, said nothing at all, just wrote a number down on a napkin and folded it into his shirt pocket like it was something he intended to carry for a while. The mechanic didn't join the noise. He stood at the workbench with both palms flat against the wood on either side of the ledger, the way he'd stood over engines his whole life, waiting for a sound under the hood that would tell him what was actually broken. He thought of her hands, the calluses on the left thumb from waxed thread pulled tight 1,000 times, the way she never looked up when the bell over the door rang, only when the boots came off and hit her counter. Outside, one by one, engines started coughing to life in the gravel lot, headlights swinging wide arcs across the clubhouse wall before straightening out onto the dark ribbon of highway. Not all of them, not yet, but enough that the sound carried, low and rolling, out past the tree line toward Route 9, toward a hospital room where a woman lay unconscious under a blanket too thin for how cold the nights got out there, and toward morning, still hours away, when the rest would come. He rode last. That was the rule, unspoken but absolute. The man who carried the reason rides at the back, so the whole column moves like a single animal with its heart at the tail. He'd learned that in another life, in another country, watching convoys crawl through heat that made the air look like water. Nobody explained it to him twice. You just knew where you belonged when the thing that mattered was riding in your saddlebag, wrapped in a shop rag that still smelled of leather dye. 41 riders by the time the lot cleared. Not 60, not yet. The phone tree did the rest. Somewhere past midnight, a woman 2 towns over sat up in bed because her husband's phone buzzed against the nightstand, and she watched him read a text with his jaw tightening the way it did before deployments, before funerals, before anything that mattered. He didn't explain. He just started pulling on his boots. Somewhere else, a man who'd left the life for a 9-to-5 and a mortgage and a daughter in braces stood in his garage at 1 a.m, staring at a motorcycle under a canvas cover he hadn't touched in 14 months, and thought about a boy he'd once given $40 and a granola bar outside a truck stop on Route 9, a boy whose name he'd never asked and had somehow never forgotten. The mechanic rode with the ledger against his ribs, the leather warm from his body heat, and every mile marker he passed felt like a page he hadn't read yet. He thought about check marks, 88 of them, small and slanted, made with whatever pen she'd had close at hand, sometimes blue, sometimes the stub of a pencil, once in what looked like grease pencil borrowed from her own workbench. Each one a kid who'd walked out of her shop and, at some point after, walked into a life she could live with. He thought about the 3 that had none. A boy called something like a bird, a girl's name, short, plain, unadorned, a description instead of a name, the kid from the blue truck, like she'd run out of time to ask, or he'd run out of time to tell her. The highway unspooled gray and empty under his headlight, the white lines ticking past like seconds on a clock nobody had wound in years. Behind him, the column stretched long enough that when he checked his mirror, he saw only the nearest 6 or 7 lights, the rest swallowed by dark and distance, trusting the ones ahead to know the way. Ahead, the hospital sat at the edge of Black Ridge, low and flat-roofed. Its windows lit the pale, sleepless yellow of a building that never fully closed its eyes. Somewhere inside it, a woman lay under a blanket that wasn't warm enough, machines keeping quiet count of a heart that had spent 30 years measuring other people's feet and never once asked to be measured itself. He didn't know yet how many more engines would join before sunrise. He only knew the number was still climbing. The dispatcher at the all-night diner 2 exits back had taken the call at 4:10 a.m. and passed it hand to hand like a lit match. A waitress to a trucker to a woman pumping diesel who happened to wear a patch on her vest. And from there, It had gone the way word goes through people who ride, fast, low, without needing to be dressed up. He had heard it that way himself, 3 hours earlier, standing in the clubhouse kitchen with the ledger open under a bare bulb, reading names into a room that had gone very still. Now the names rode with him. He thought of the check marks first, because they were easier. 88 small marks, each one a kid who had walked far enough to be seen walking away clean. He let himself hold that number for a mile or two, the way a man holds a good memory before setting it down to deal with the harder one. Then the other 3 again. No mark, no closing. A voice on his earpiece, one of the road captains, calling back from somewhere ahead in the dark, told him 2 more clubs had turned onto Route 9 behind the main column, riders who'd heard it secondhand and decided secondhand was enough. He didn't ask who. He didn't need to. The road had a way of finding out who mattered to it. The gas stations blurred past unlit, their signs dead or dying, letters missing the way teeth go missing from an old man's smile. He passed the exit for the truck stop itself without slowing, the low roofline dark against a sky just beginning to gray at its far eastern edge, and he thought of the shop's little window, the one with the hand-painted sign that had never once, in 11 years, said anything about payment. He thought about the cashier who would be coming on shift soon, unaware yet of what the morning held, still thinking her biggest task of the day was restocking the coffee urn. He thought about the boy called something like a bird, wondered if birds migrated toward warmth or away from it, wondered which direction this one had gone. The hospital's yellow windows grew larger in his vision, no longer a smear on the horizon but a shape with edges, a low building holding one very tired heart inside it, and somewhere beyond that, further out where headlights kept multiplying in his mirrors, 60 engines and climbing, all converging on a woman who had never asked to be found, only to keep finding others. The white line ticked past, the dark thinned by degrees. He eased off the throttle as the exit ramp came up, and behind him the column began to bend and gather, the way rivers gather before they reach the place the map has been calling them all along. The exit ramp curved down into a stretch of frontage road lined with sodium lights, most of them dead, a few humming that particular orange that made everything look older than it was. He rode it slow, the way he'd ridden into 100 unfamiliar towns before, reading the place before it could read him, a shuttered feed store, a church with plywood over one window, a hospital sign missing its middle letters so it read Hos Ital, which struck him, for one absurd second, as the truest description he'd seen all night. The parking lot was already filling. Not with visitors, with machines. He saw them arranged in loose rows near the ambulance bay, kickstands down, chrome catching what little light there was, riders standing in small clusters with their hands in their jacket pockets and their breath showing in the cold. Nobody was talking much. A few had removed their helmets and were holding them the way men hold hats at funerals, out of habit more than reverence, because nobody had told them yet whether this was that kind of mourning. He counted without meaning to. Old habit from convoys, from counting trucks in a line and knowing if one went missing. 40, maybe. 45. More coming. He could still hear them, a low, continuous thunder somewhere back along Route 9, the sound arriving before the bikes did, the way weather arrives before rain. He parked at the edge and killed the engine, and sat there a moment with his hands still on the grips, the ledger a weight against his ribs, where he'd tucked it inside his jacket to keep it from the wind. A woman in scrubs stood near the sliding doors, arms crossed, watching the lot fill with a kind of stunned, professional calm, the look of someone who had seen every version of a bad morning and was now seeing a version she didn't have a category for. He walked toward her. His knees ached the way they always did after 3 hours in the saddle, a small, familiar pain that told him he was still capable of feeling anything at all. "You family?" she asked. He thought about the honest answer, which was no, and the true answer, which was more complicated than the word aloud. "Something like it," he said. She studied him, the leather, the patch, the gray in his beard, the way people always did before deciding whether to be afraid, and something in her face settled instead into something closer to relief, as if his arrival confirmed a rumor she'd already half believed. "There's a lot of you," she said. "There's more coming," he said. and behind him the sound on the highway kept climbing, kept gathering, the whole dark road behind him narrowing down to this one lit building, this one door, this one woman inside it who had spent 11 years making sure nobody's story ended in a ditch without a name attached to it. The doors behind her hissed open on their hydraulic hinge, and the smell that came out was the smell every hospital had, antiseptic laid over something the antiseptic couldn't quite reach, and he made himself walk through it because walking through it was the only kind of courage this morning required. The waiting room was fluorescent and half empty, 3 chairs bolted to a rail, a television bolted higher up playing something with the sound off. The night cashier from the truck stop was already there, in the corner, still in her work apron because no one had thought to tell her to go home, her hands wrapped around a paper coffee cup she wasn't drinking from. She looked up when he came in, and something passed over her face. Not surprise, he realized, but arithmetic, the same math he'd been doing since 4 in the morning. "They took her up an hour ago," she said. "Stroke. Bad one. They're not saying much." She looked past him, toward the doors, where the sound of engines had not stopped, had in fact grown thick enough to feel through the floor. "That noise you?" "Some of it. There's a lot of it. I told the desk lady the same thing." The cashier almost laughed, the closest thing to it this room would allow, and then didn't, because laughing felt like the wrong shape for what was happening. She set the coffee down. She never let anybody help her carry anything, she said. Not a box, not a bag, not a bad day. 11 years I watched her carry everything alone, and I never once saw her ask. He thought of the ledger folded now inside his jacket, against his ribs, 91 names pressed flat against his heart like a second, older pulse. He didn't take it out. Not here. Not yet. A nurse came through the far door with a clipboard and a face arranged for delivering news gently, and the room went still around her the way rooms do, and she said the words "families are given, stable, for now, we're monitoring, you can't go back yet," and the cashier nodded at each one like she was checking them off a list of her own, some private ledger of hope she'd been keeping without a book to write it in. Outside, the engines began cutting off in staggered waves, one after another, until the silence that followed was almost louder than the noise had been, a parking lot full of men and women standing beside their machines in the gray morning light, not moving toward the doors yet, just standing, the way people stand outside a church before they've decided whether they're ready to go in. He looked at the cashier. "She kept a book," he said. "I don't think you know what's in it yet." And outside, the first of the 60 began walking toward the entrance, unhurried, the sound of boots on wet asphalt filling the silence the engines had left behind. The cashier did not ask what he meant. She had worked the counter long enough to know that some questions answer themselves if you wait, and she waited, watching the boots come across the wet asphalt through the window, 60 pairs of them, scuffed and salt-stained, moving without hurry toward a set of double doors that had never seen this many people arrive for one woman. She had seen men like this pass through for 30 years, big, weathered, quiet in the particular way that made other customers cross the lot to avoid them, and she had never once seen them stand still like they were standing now, hats off, some of them, though no one had told them to take them off. He set the ledger on the counter between them, cover cracked, wax thread holding the spine together like a wound someone had sewn shut with their own hands. He didn't open it, not yet. He watched her look at it the way people look at something they've been told is heavier than it appears. 91 names, he said. 11 years. The cashier's mouth moved, but nothing came out of it for a moment. She had restocked the shelf beside that shop 1,000 times. Coffee, sandwiches wrapped tight, a blanket folded under the counter for the cold nights. And never once had she asked why the light stayed on back there, after the pumps went quiet. She had told herself it wasn't her business. She had told herself a lot of things. "I used to hear the sewing machine," she said. "Late, after close. You ever see who came through? Sometimes. Never for long. She didn't like being watched doing it." Outside, the first riders had reached the doors and stopped there, letting the automatic glass slide open and shut, once, twice, without walking through, as if the building itself needed a moment to decide whether it could hold what was coming into it. A woman near the front, leather vest gone gray at the shoulders, a patch worn thin from decades of rain, looked back once at the lot full of parked machines, then turned and stepped inside. Others followed in twos and threes, boots wet, breath fogging in the cold hospital light, filling the waiting room the way water fills a low place in the ground, without asking permission, without needing to. The cashier watched them come, and felt something crack open in her chest that she didn't have a name for yet. "They're not here for a stranger," she said, more to herself than to him. "No," he said, "they're here because she made them family, and never told them." He opened the ledger then, just to the first page, and set it flat on the counter, where the light could reach it, and did not turn it any further. Not yet. The names underneath were still waiting. A nurse pushed through the double doors then, clipboard against her chest, and the noise in the waiting room fell away so fast it left a ringing behind it, the kind of silence that comes after a gunshot in a closed room. She looked at the leather vests, the patches, the gray beards dripping cold rain onto linoleum that had never held this many boots at once, and for a moment she did not speak. Then she said only that the woman was stable, that stable did not mean good, that the family could go in two at a time. No one moved. 60 men and women who rode into weather other people wouldn't drive through, stood still in a hospital lobby, because none of them knew, in that instant, which two of them counted as family enough to go first. The mechanic looked down at the ledger still open on the counter, then closed it without turning the page, and said that the woman in that bed had no family the hospital would recognize on any form, and that was the whole reason they were standing there. A rider near the window, thick-necked, a faded eagle inked across his forearm gone blue with age, said that he'd carried her name for 11 years without knowing it was hers, that he'd only ever thought of her as the woman who fixed his cousin's boots the winter his cousin slept in a truck bed off Route 9. He said it flat, like a man reading a mile marker, but his hands were shaking when he said it. The cashier came around the counter with a tray of coffee no one had asked her to bring, setting cups into hands without a word, the way she'd set sandwiches by a workbench for 11 years, without asking questions either. She moved through the room like she'd done it 1,000 times before, because in some way she had, feeding people who didn't know how to ask for what they needed, watching quietly instead of interfering. She caught the mechanic's eye once, and neither of them said anything about it. 2 riders were chosen, or maybe they simply stepped forward because someone had to, and they went through the doors the nurse held open, disappearing down a hallway too bright and too clean for the men who walked its length. The rest stayed behind, filling chairs, filling the floor space between chairs, some of them sitting with their backs against the wall, the way men sit in the field when there's nothing left to do but wait. The mechanic stayed at the counter with the ledger under his palm, feeling the weight of 91 names pressing up through the leather like a pulse, and somewhere down that hallway, behind a door none of them could see, the woman who had written every one of those names lay breathing on a machine that counted for her. The 2 who went through the doors came back an hour later with nothing to report, which was itself a kind of report. Nothing changed. Nothing worsened. The machines kept their rhythm behind the wall, and the nurse who'd let them through kept passing at intervals, her clipboard held against her chest like something she needed to protect. The mechanic watched the clock above the vending machines because it was easier than watching the hallway, and he noticed the way its second hand caught for half a beat at the 12 before releasing, some small mechanical hesitation nobody else seemed to see. He thought about the ledger's spine, cracked in that same place, over and over, from a hand opening it at the same page for 11 years. He thought about how a thing could wear a groove into itself just from being used the way it was meant to be used. A doctor came out once, spoke in the flattened language doctors use when they don't want to promise anything, and went back in. The room absorbed it the way it absorbed everything, without complaint, without much visible reaction at all, just a slight settling, like men lowering themselves half an inch deeper into chairs that weren't built for their shoulders. Someone's phone rang and was silenced before the second ring. Someone else stood, stretched a back gone stiff with sitting, and sat again. The cashier brought more coffee near noon, unasked, the same as she'd have done at the counter back home, and this time she set a cup in front of the mechanic specifically, not looking at him when she did it, just setting it down and moving on to the next man. He didn't drink it. He kept his hand on the ledger and the ledger on the counter and let the coffee go cold beside it, and when he finally looked up, he saw that the room outside, through the tall windows facing the lot, had filled further still. More bikes. More men standing beside them in the heat, not coming in, just being present, the way a congregation stands outside a church too full to hold them. Word had gone out past the 60. 2 allied clubs became 4. A rider from 3 counties over showed up on a borrowed truck because his bike had thrown a chain the night before, and he hadn't wanted to miss it. Nobody organized any of this. Nobody needed to. Inside, the mechanic opened the ledger again, not to read, just to look at the shape of her handwriting, the small slant of it, steady even in the entries clearly written by lamplight or exhaustion. He turned to the third to last page and stopped there, his thumb resting just below a name with no checkmark beside it, and he understood, the way a man understands weather before it arrives, that some accounting was owed and that no machine down that hallway was going to be the one to settle it. The name under his thumb read, Bird. And beneath it, in her small, slanted hand, a single line. Boy, maybe 15, sole worn through to the sock, wouldn't say where he was walking to. No date of return, no mark. He had passed this page twice already that morning, and each time his eye had skidded off it, the way a man's eye skids off a debt he doesn't yet know how he'll pay. Now he held still on it. Outside, a horn sounded once, short, not impatient. A greeting from one rider to another arriving late, and the sound carried through the glass and settled into the waiting room like a stone dropped into water, rings widening, then gone. A nurse crossed near the doors with a clipboard against her chest and did not look at the ledger, though her eyes moved once toward the window, toward the lot filling past its lines, past the shoulder of the road, out toward the highway itself where more headlights winked in the noon glare. He closed the book without meaning to, the way a man closes a door on a room he isn't ready to enter twice. He looked instead at his own hands, cracked at the knuckle, a burn scar along the base of the thumb from a manifold years back, hands that had signed for freight in 40 states and had not, until 2 days ago, held anything that felt this much like a Bible. The witness came through with a tray she hadn't been asked to bring, coffee, real cups this time, borrowed from somewhere in the back, and set 2 down without a word, the way she'd set sandwiches by a workbench for 11 years without asking why a woman needed to feed strangers after dark. She glanced at the ledger, then at him. "You found more names in there," she said. Not a question. 3, he said. No checks. She nodded slowly, as if she had already known the number, had maybe known it longer than he had, watching that shop light burn late through the years, without ever once walking over to ask what it was for. She'd have wanted them finished, she said. Not mourned, finished. He looked at her for a long moment, at the tired competence in her face, the kind that came from decades of quiet shifts and quieter grief, and something in him settled the way gravel settles under a tire finding its line. Behind them, the doors to the corridor opened, and a doctor came out with the particular slowness of a man who has practiced saying hard things gently and still hates the saying, and the room seemed to draw one collective breath, 60 riders and more outside the glass, all of them turning without being told to turn, all of them already knowing, in the animal way a pack knows weather, that whatever came next would change the shape of what they'd ridden here to do. The doctor stopped 6 feet from the mechanic, close enough that the fluorescent light caught the exhaustion in his eyes, but far enough that he still had room to retreat if the words failed him. He did not retreat. He said what he had come to say, plainly, the way men learn to say it after enough years of saying it to strangers in waiting rooms, that smell of antiseptic and burnt coffee. The stroke had been severe. There had been a second event overnight, smaller, but in the wrong place. She was stable. She was not going to wake up in any way that mattered. Nobody moved for a moment that stretched longer than a moment should. The cashier's hand found the edge of the counter behind her, not for support exactly, more like a woman touching wood for luck she didn't believe in anymore. The mechanic felt the ledger's weight in his jacket pocket, felt it the way a man feels a stone he forgot he was carrying, and thought, absurdly, that it seemed heavier now than it had an hour ago, as if the book itself understood what had just been said. Outside, through the glass doors, 60 men and women stood in the gray early light, and none of them had heard the words directly, but somehow the news traveled anyway. passed hand to hand through the small human telegraph of shifted weight and lowered eyes, until the whole parking lot understood without a word being spoken across the distance. Someone near the back took off their hat. It was not a gesture anyone had asked for. It simply happened, the way weather happens. The doctor said they could go in, 2 at a time, if they wanted, if she had family who wanted to sit with her. The mechanic looked at the cashier. The cashier looked at the doors. She didn't have family, the cashier said. Not since her boy. She's got 60 riders in a parking lot, the mechanic said. The cashier almost laughed, the sound catching somewhere before it became a laugh, turning instead into something closer to a held breath let go wrong. She'd hate that, she said, all this fuss. She's getting it anyway. Behind them, one of the older patched members, a man who had gone quiet since the ledger reading the night before, stepped forward from the small knot of riders who'd been allowed inside. He had a boot in his hand. Not new, not his own either, a boy's boot, size 9, the leather gone pale at the toe from years of walking. He set it on the table beside the ledger without a word, the way a man sets down something he has decided finally to stop carrying alone. Found it in my saddlebag this morning, he said. Been meaning to bring it back to her for 6 years. The mechanic looked at the boot, then at the ledger, then at the doors down the corridor where the room was waiting, and understood, with a clarity that felt almost physical, that the ledger was no longer the only thing in this building that needed finishing. The old rider did not sit. He stood with his hands empty now, the way a man stands after he has handed off a weight he did not know how to name, and he looked at the boot on the table as if it might still walk off on its own. 6 years, he had said. 6 years of that boot riding, in the bottom of a saddlebag, wrapped in a shop rag, moved from bike to bike whenever he traded, never once making it back through the door it had come from. She fixed the heel, he said, told the kid to come back in a week for the other one. He didn't come back. Nobody asked why. Nobody needed to. The highway took kids the way weather takes paint, slow, then all at once, and never with an explanation anyone bothered to write down. The cashier reached out and touched the leather, just the toe of it, the way she might touch a photograph of someone she'd once known well enough to miss, and not well enough to grieve properly. She used to say the boots remembered more than the kids did, she said leather holds a shape even after the foot's gone. The mechanic thought of the ledger's spine, cracked and rebound, holding 91 shapes it would not let go of either. Down the corridor, a door opened and a nurse crossed into the hallway, her shoes quiet on the tile, her face doing nothing that gave anything away, and the room seemed to lean toward her without moving. 60 men and one heavy-set woman, all listening for a sound that did not come. The door closed again. The corridor exhaled. The old rider picked the boot back up, turned it over once in his hands, checked the sole out of some old reflex he probably didn't notice himself performing, and set it back down exactly where it had been. Figured it belonged closer to her than my saddlebag, he said. Even now. Especially now, the mechanic said. Outside, past the glass doors, the 60 bikes stood in their long silver rows under a sky gone the color of wet ash, and a few of the younger riders had drifted back out to stand near them, not because they wanted distance from the waiting, but because standing near the machines was the only prayer some of them knew how to say with their bodies. One trooper had parked his cruiser at the far end of the lot an hour ago and had not moved since, watching, deciding, apparently, that whatever this was, it wasn't his to break up. The mechanic looked at the ledger again, open to the page with 3 names and no check marks, and beside it now the pale boot with the fixed heel and the sole worn thin on the outside edge, the way a foot wears a boot when it favors one leg without knowing why. He thought, there is more in this building than paper. He thought, there is more on the road than we counted. And somewhere behind the closed door, machines kept a rhythm that had nothing left to say to anyone, while the men in the waiting room began, without deciding to remember out loud. A rider with a jaw scarred white from some old fight cleared his throat first, not loud, just enough to break the hum of the idling engines outside. He said he remembered a boy sitting cross-legged by the propane tanks in the rain, no jacket, eating out of a bag someone had left for him, and that when the rider had offered him a ride, he'd shaken his head, like the offer itself was a trap he'd learned to smell. He said the boy's boots had been split clean through at the toe, flapping like a mouth. He didn't know if that boy was Bird or the kid from the blue truck, or somebody who'd never made it into the ledger at all, and saying that out loud seemed to cost him something, the not knowing. Another one, older, heavier through the shoulders, said he remembered a girl at the pumps with hair chopped short and uneven, like she'd done it herself with a knife in a gas station bathroom, and that she wouldn't look at any of them directly, only at their boots, like she was reading something in the leather the rest of them couldn't see. He said he'd bought her a coffee, and she'd thanked him in a voice so quiet he'd had to lean down to catch it, and then she was gone before he finished his cigarette. He said he hadn't thought about her in years until tonight, and now he couldn't stop. The mechanic listened and did not add his own memory, because he didn't have one. He had only ever known the woman's shop from the outside, the light under the door at odd hours, the sound of a hammer against a last that he'd never once bothered to ask about. He understood now that not asking had been its own kind of mercy toward himself, a way of not knowing what he wasn't doing. The trooper at the far end of the lot got out of his cruiser and stood with his arms crossed, watching the rows of bikes the way a man watches weather he can't do anything about. A nurse passed the waiting room window twice, not stopping, her face arranged into the particular blankness of someone carrying news she hadn't decided how to deliver yet. The heavy-set cashier came through the automatic doors with a paper bag of sandwiches nobody had asked her to bring, set them on the vinyl chairs, and stood near the mechanic without saying anything, the way she'd stood near the shop door for years without being asked either. She looked at the ledger in his lap, at the boot beside it, and something in her face tightened and held. Outside, one by one, the idling engines went quiet, until the lot held nothing but wind moving through spokes and the low murmur of men trying to remember faces they'd once let ride out of sight. The doctor came out at 11 minutes past 10, and the mechanic knew the time exactly because he had been watching the clock above the vending machines, the way a man watches a fuse. The doctor did not sit. He stood in the doorway with his hands loose at his sides, and he said the words doctors say when they have practiced saying them in a mirror and still cannot make them sound like anything other than a door closing, complications from the stroke. Bleeding they could not stop without risk greater than the bleeding itself. Comfortable, he said, which the mechanic understood to mean unconscious, which he understood to mean gone in every way that mattered except the paperwork. Nobody in the waiting room moved for a long moment. Then the oldest of the riders, a man with a jaw scar from a bar fight 40 years dead, took off his cut and folded it once and set it on the chair beside him, not as ceremony, just as a man setting down something heavy so his hands would be free for whatever came next. The mechanic asked if they could see her. The doctor said family only, and then looked at the room. 60 men and women in leather, patches faded to the color of old rust, none of them her blood, all of them standing like blood, and something in his face reconsidered the definition he'd been handed in medical school. 2 at a time, he said. They went in pairs, the way they'd learned to move through doorways that might be trouble, except this doorway held no trouble, only a small woman in a bed too large for her, tubes doing the breathing her body no longer volunteered to do, her hands, the mechanic noticed this before anything else, still faintly stained at the fingertips with the dark of old leather dye, a stain that hadn't come out in 30 years and wouldn't come out now. He went in near the middle, with the cashier beside him because she'd asked to go with someone and he was the only one she knew by more than a nod. He set the ledger on the blanket near her hand, open to the last written page, the 3 names still bare of any mark. He didn't say anything to her. He didn't believe she could hear him, and even if she could, he had never been a man who trusted words to do the lifting. He touched the edge of the ledger once, the way a man touches a fence post to make sure it will hold his weight, and then he stepped back to let the next 2 in, and outside the window, the sky over Black Ridge had gone the pale, uncommitted gray of a morning that hadn't decided yet what kind of day it meant to be. She died at 4 the next morning, 2 days after the stroke had taken her down onto the concrete of her own shop, and the hospital called it complications, which was a word the mechanic turned over in his mouth later and found too small for what it meant. No one was in the room when it happened except a nurse doing rounds, A woman who had seen enough of these quiet exits to know one when she felt it, the way a change in air pressure tells a body a storm has passed through without thunder. She noted the time. She pulled the sheet with the practiced gentleness of someone who had done it more times than she could count, and did not want to count them. Outside, the sky had made its decision. Clear, cold, a hard blue with no weather in it at all, the kind of morning that looks like it's apologizing for the night before. The word reached the clubhouse before the sun had cleared the water tower. It did not arrive as a phone call so much as a silence that spread, one rider telling another in a voice pitched low, the news moving through the garage the way smoke moves through a room that has no windows open, not fast but total, reaching every corner eventually. The mechanic was refilling the coffee pot when he heard it, and he did not stop his hands from finishing the pour, though something in his chest folded inward, quiet and complete, the way a barn does when the last post finally gives. There was no talk yet of what would happen next. That would come later, in pieces, in arguments that weren't really arguments, in a room full of grown men and one heavy-set woman deciding without much discussion that the ledger's last page did not close just because the hand that wrote it had stopped moving. But that morning there was only the fact of her being gone, and the ledger sitting on a shelf in the mechanic's saddlebag, 3 names still bare, and somewhere out past the reach of Route 9, in a county he couldn't picture, on a road he'd never ridden, in a life he knew nothing about, a boy called Bird was waking up in a bunkhouse he didn't know was about to matter to 60 men who had never met him. The cashier locked up the truck stop that evening for the first time in longer than she could remember, turned the sign in the window, and stood for a moment looking at the dark little room behind the counter, where a bench and a lamp and a coffee can of nails sat exactly as they'd been left. She locked the door, but she did not go home. She sat instead in the folding chair she kept behind the register, the one with the cracked vinyl seat that had outlasted 3 managers and 2 remodels, and she let herself do the thing she had not let herself do all day, which was nothing at all. No coffee to pour. No sandwich to wrap in wax paper and set where a hand could take it without a word being said. She sat in the dim light coming off the pumps outside, diesel blue and steady, and she thought about how many nights she had watched that little lamp burn behind the shop wall and never once gone back to ask what it was for. She had known. Of course she had known. She had simply understood, the way you understand weather, that some things are not improved by being spoken of. Outside, the highway kept doing what it always did, indifferent, endless, headlights rising and falling over the ridge like something breathing. A truck idled too long at pump 6. A dog barked twice somewhere behind the fence line, and then didn't again. She thought of the boy who used to come in October, thin coat, 1 boot laced with wire, and how he'd sat at the counter once and eaten eggs like he hadn't decided yet whether to trust that they were free, and how she'd never told him they were, only that the register was slow that night and he might as well eat before it caught up. She had never once mentioned him to the woman in the shop. She hadn't needed to. The woman had known too, not the names, not the ledger, none of the particulars, but the shape of it, the way you know the shape of a room in the dark because you've walked it enough times to trust your feet. She stood eventually, because the body insists on that, and went to the back hallway and stood in the doorway of the little room. The lamp was off now. The bench sat square and quiet, the coffee can of nails catching a thin line of light from the parking lot. She did not go in. It did not feel like hers to enter. Not yet, maybe not ever, though she suspected that would change before long, in ways she couldn't guess at standing there. She reached over instead and turned the knob until it clicked, unlocked, the way it had always been kept, though there had never before been a reason to notice that it was. Then she turned off the last light in the building and went out to her car, and behind her the truck stop settled into its long blue quiet, waiting, the way it had always waited, for whoever might come next. The garage smelled of cold engine oil and the particular sweetness of old rubber, and the boy from the blue truck had learned by then to sleep in 4-hour stretches, the way you do when the body no longer trusts a full night. He'd been in the room above the garage for 11 days. There was a mattress, a lamp with a cracked shade, a hook on the wall where his jacket hung like it had always belonged there. He hadn't unpacked the duffel bag. He kept meaning to, and kept not doing it, the same way a man circles a door before deciding to walk through it. Downstairs, the owner, a wiry man with forearms like braided rope, who asked no questions and offered no pity, which the boy had decided was its own kind of mercy, was teaching him to bleed a brake line. His hands remembered things his mind had given up trying to hold on to, the click of a fitting, the give of a bolt under proper torque. It was the first useful thing he'd done with his hands in 3 years that wasn't stealing or running. He thought, sometimes, of the woman with the ledger. He hadn't known her name either, not really. Only the sound of the little bell over her shop door, and the particular quiet of her hands working a sole by lamplight while he sat on an overturned crate and said nothing, because there was nothing to say, and she never asked him to. He didn't know she was gone. No one had told him yet, because no one had thought to, because the riders who found him had been focused on the finding, not the explaining, and grief has its own order of operations. That evening the owner handed him an envelope, his first pay, folded once, the bills soft with use, and said only, "Don't spend it all on cigarettes," which was as close to affection as the man allowed himself. The boy took it upstairs and sat on the mattress and held it for a long time without opening it, the way he'd once held her ledger open in his mind, wondering if his name was still in there somewhere, wondering if it mattered that it was. Outside, the light was doing what August light does at that hour, turning gold, then bronze, then something without a name, sliding down behind the tree line, while cicadas kept up their long insistence. He didn't know that 60 men had ridden for a woman he'd never learned to thank. He didn't know that his name, in her careful hand, still sat without its mark. He only knew that, for the first time in a long while, he had a bed to return to, and intended to. The clubhouse kept the ledger in a glass case near the bar, the pages turned open to the spread with 3 names, though now all 3 carried marks, small, deliberate check marks added in a different hand, blue ink instead of the faded black she'd used for 11 years. The mechanic had made the marks himself, one evening in September, using a pen borrowed from the truck stop counter, and he'd sat with the book a long time before he did it, as if asking permission from someone who could no longer give it. He drew the checks the way he imagined she would have, small, unhurried, without flourish, and when he was done, he closed the ledger and did not open it again for a week. The bench arrived on a Tuesday, built by 2 prospects who'd never held a hammer for anything but engine work, and it sat crooked for 3 days until someone leveled it properly. They filled the drawers with what she would have kept, waxed thread, awls, a coffee can of mismatched nails, socks still folded in their store plastic, boots in every size donated from closets across 3 counties. The brass plate came last, engraved by a man in the next town who charged them nothing when he heard what it was for. It went up quiet, no ceremony, no photographs, just the owner and the cashier and 2 riders holding it level while a third drilled the screws. The night cashier dusted it every evening without being told to, the way she'd once restocked coffee and sandwiches near a door that never had a sign on it. She didn't say much about it to the customers who asked, only that it was for anyone who needed it, and that they shouldn't feel they had to explain themselves. Word moved slow, but it moved. Through diners, through dispatch chatter, through the particular telegraph that travels along a highway among people who live in its margins. A girl left a note under the bench's lid, folded twice, thanking someone she never named. A boy took a pair of boots without asking and left $3 he clearly couldn't spare. The mechanic still stopped for fuel most weeks, out of habit more than need, and each time he glanced through the window at the bench sitting where her workbench used to be, the concrete floor scrubbed clean of everything except what stayed in memory. He never told anyone how often he thought about the day he found her, the wrench in his hand, the ledger open to a page that hadn't yet earned its last entry. He only knew the drawers needed restocking again, and that somewhere out past the tree line, another set of boots was walking toward them, worn thin, still years from wherever it was going. The seasons turned the way they always had along that stretch of highway, indifferent to what had happened in the small building beside the pumps. Snow came early that first winter, 3 inches by the second week of November, and the night cashier kept a space heater running near the bench so the leather wouldn't crack in the cold. She never asked the club for permission to do this. She simply did it, the way she'd always restocked the coffee and the sandwiches without anyone asking her to, and when the mechanic noticed the heater's orange coil glowing behind the glass one January night, he understood that the bench had become hers to tend as much as anyone's. He kept coming back to the ledger, though it now lived in a fireproof box at the clubhouse, its waxed thread beginning to fray at the spine from all the hands that had opened it since. Riders who'd never met her would sometimes ask to see it, turning the pages slowly, reading names that meant nothing to them and everything to her. 91 names, 91 dates, a record of a woman's decision, made and remade every night for 11 years, to notice what the world had trained itself not to see. The garage that had taken in the boy from the blue truck sent a photograph that spring, him standing beside a car he'd rebuilt himself, grease on his forearms, something in his face that hadn't been there the day they found him sleeping in the back seat with the windows fogged. The mechanic pinned it above his workbench at home, next to nothing else, and looked at it some mornings before his coffee, the way another man might look at a photograph of his own children. Nell wrote once, a short letter with careful handwriting, thanking the men she'd never actually met, describing her grandmother's kitchen and a dog that slept at the foot of her bed. Bird didn't write. Bird wasn't the writing kind, but word came through the outreach coordinator that he'd stopped drinking, that he'd started something like a life, and for the mechanic that was enough. More than enough. More than he'd let himself hope for on the morning he'd first read 3 names aloud in a room full of quiet men. Still, some nights, standing at the pumps with the wind moving low across the flat, dark fields, he found himself watching the tree line the way he used to watch a highway for weather he couldn't yet see. He didn't know why. He only knew the feeling hadn't left him, the sense that somewhere out there, another set of boots was still walking, and that the bench would be waiting when it arrived. A year came and went, then another, and the truck stop outside Black Ridge stayed exactly the size it had always been, a diner, a fuel island, a shop with a bench in the corner, where the smell of leather and neat's foot oil never quite went away. The night cashier kept the coffee filled and the sandwiches stocked near the bench without anyone asking her to, the way she always had, only now she did it for a memory instead of a woman, and she found she didn't mind the difference much. Truckers still came through at 2 a.m. and bought gas and left. Kids still came through too, fewer than before, but never none. A girl with a torn sneaker in October, a boy in February with frostbite starting in 2 toes, a pair of siblings in the dead heat of July who took socks and boots and said nothing and left before sunrise. No one asked their names. No one wrote them down. The ledger sat behind glass in the clubhouse now, its cracked spine and waxed thread preserved the way men preserve the things that made them, and every rider who passed it on his way to the bar touched 2 fingers to the cover without ever discussing why. The brass plate above the bench never got a name, and nobody argued for one. For the walk ahead, that was all it said, in letters small enough that a person had to lean close to read them, which seemed right, since the woman it was for had never once asked to be noticed either. The mechanic aged the way men age when the worst of their grief has already been spent. Slower, quieter, his beard going the rest of the way to gray, his knees complaining on cold mornings the way engines complain before they catch. He never told the story often. When he did, he told it in the fewest words he could manage, the way she might have told it herself, and he always ended it the same way, not with her death, but with the sound of 60 engines coming down Route 9 in the gray hour before a hospital's shift change, a sound like weather arriving, like something the whole flat country had been waiting 11 years to hear. He believed, though he couldn't have said exactly why, that she'd have hated the fuss and loved the bench, that she'd have sat at it in the evenings the way she always had, hunched under the one good light, turning some stranger's ruined boot in her hands, like a question she intended to answer before morning. He believed the boots still walking out there, the ones with no names yet, were the only monument that would have made sense to her. So the bench stayed open, the tools stayed sharp, the door stayed unlocked, and on Route 9, in the wide dark distance past the last streetlight, something kept moving toward it, the way it always had, the way it always would.